I'm Sarah Mitchell, 34 years old, and I used to believe that being the invisible daughter was just my role in the family. On New Year's Eve, while my sister Jessica dazzled guests in our parents' Westchester mansion, I was banished to the kitchen like hired help cooking for 18 people who treated me like furniture. But when I accidentally discovered credit card statements with my name on accounts I'd never opened, I realized this wasn't just about being overlooked anymore. My own family had been committing federal crimes using my identity while I served them dinner with a smile. The night I walked out of that kitchen, 44 frantic phone calls started pouring in. They weren't calling because they missed their daughter. They were calling because their criminal empire was crumbling and I held all the evidence. What happens when the family scapegoat finally fights back? Let me take you back to where it began. I own a successful catering business called Mitchell's Catering. You'd think that would earn me some respect at family gatherings, but apparently not. Tonight I was standing in my parents' kitchen in Westchester County, wearing an apron like hired help, while my 29-year-old sister Jessica held court in the living room like some kind of princess. The house itself is beautiful, I'll give you that. It's a 1987 colonial that my grandmother Rose left behind when she passed in 2019. Worth about $1.2 million now, sitting on 2 acres with mature oak trees and a circular driveway that makes you feel important just pulling up to it. Tonight it was decorated for our annual New Year's Eve party, with white lights strung along the wraparound porch and garland draped over every doorway. Mom had invited 18 people this year. Extended family neighbors, some of Dad's old colleagues from his insurance days. The usual crowd that shows up to eat good food and gossip about everyone who isn't there. I'd been cooking since 3 in the afternoon, preparing everything from bacon-wrapped scallops to beef tenderloin, while Jessica spent 2 hours getting ready upstairs. When she finally made her grand entrance at 6:30, I had to admit she looked stunning. Red designer dress that probably cost more than I spend on groceries in 2 months' hair professionally styled makeup flawless. She walked into the living room and immediately became the center of attention, laughing and hugging everyone like she was hosting the party instead of just showing up to it. That's when I noticed something was off about her though. Her hands were shaking slightly when she thought no one was looking, and she kept checking her phone with this worried expression. But the moment someone approached her, she'd flip that bright smile back on like a light switch. Mom Linda Mitchell is 62 and spent 30 years as a school principal before retiring. You'd think all those years dealing with difficult children would have taught her something about fairness, but apparently not when it comes to her own daughters. She walked into the kitchen where I was plating appetizers and didn't even look at what I was doing. Jessica is better with people, she said, adjusting her pearl necklace like she was delivering some profound wisdom. You know how much everyone loves your cooking, Sarah. You're so good at it. I paused, holding a tray of stuffed mushrooms. What about after I finish the appetizers? Can I join everyone? Then Mom finally looked at me, and I could see the answer in her eyes before she even spoke. Someone has to manage the kitchen, honey. There are 15 different dishes to prepare and serve tonight. Jessica has to network with the guests. Network, like this was some kind of business function instead of a family party. I wanted to point out that I run an actual business, that I network with clients and vendors every single day, that my catering company generates $285,000 a year in revenue. But I'd learned long ago that facts don't matter when you're already invisible. Dad wandered in around 7 carrying an empty beer bottle and looking for another one. Robert Mitchell is 65, retired from 30 years in insurance, and has perfected the art of avoiding conflict by pretending not to see it. He's tall and still handsome, in that distinguished gray-haired way that makes women his age giggle like teenagers. Someone has to handle the food, he said when he saw my expression, and you're so good at it, sweetheart. There it was again. The same phrase Mom had used, like they'd rehearsed it. I watched him grab another beer from the refrigerator and head back to the living room, where I could hear Jessica's laughter rising above the conversation. Through the kitchen window, I had a perfect view of the party I wasn't invited to join. Jessica was surrounded by a group that included Marcus Thompson, her 31-year-old investment banker fiancé, and his mother, Patricia. Patricia Thompson is 58 and one of the most successful real estate attorneys in Westchester County. She's the kind of woman who notices everything and remembers it all. I watched Patricia observing our family dynamics with what looked like professional interest. She kept glancing between Jessica and Marcus, then toward the kitchen where I was working. When Jessica threw her head back laughing at something, one of the neighbors said Patricia didn't smile. Instead, she looked concerned. Marcus seemed distracted too, checking his own phone frequently and giving Jessica these worried looks when she wasn't paying attention. Something was definitely going on with them, but I was too busy slicing vegetables to figure out what. The contrast between my situation and Jessica's was impossible to ignore. She was out there in her designer dress, holding a glass of champagne, being praised and admired, while I stood in the kitchen wearing an apron and handling all the work that made the party possible. It felt like a metaphor for our entire relationship. As I arranged the appetizer trays, I could hear Jessica telling everyone about her job as a marketing coordinator at some digital agency in Manhattan. The way she talked, you'd think she was running the company instead of coordinating campaigns for other people. But the guests ate it up, asking questions and nodding like she was sharing the secrets of the universe. Meanwhile, nobody mentioned my catering business. Nobody asked about my clients or my success, or the fact that I employ 8 part-time staff members. I might as well have been actual hired help for all the acknowledgement I received. The kitchen felt like a prison, but it was a familiar one. I'd been serving this family my entire life, in one way or another, always in the background, always making sure everyone else looked good. Tonight felt different, though. Tonight, the injustice of it all seemed sharper, more deliberate. I could feel something building inside me, a resentment that had been simmering for years finally starting to boil over. The party guests started arriving right at 7, and I watched through the kitchen window as Jessica transformed into the perfect hostess. She greeted each person at the front door like they were visiting royalty, with that brilliant smile and the kind of warm embrace that made everyone feel special. But I knew her well enough to notice what others missed. Her hands were trembling when she thought no one was looking, and she kept checking her phone with this worried expression that would disappear the instant someone approached her. Mom swept into the kitchen with her clipboard, because of course she had a clipboard for a family party. "The appetizers need to go out in 10 minutes, she announced, not bothering to see what I was actually doing. "And make sure you prepare all 15 dishes exactly as we discussed. Jessica is handling the social aspects tonight." Social aspects. Like I was some kind of kitchen servant instead of a daughter who might want to spend New Year's Eve with her own family. I bit my tongue and focused on arranging the bacon-wrapped scallops on silver platters that had belonged to Grandmother Rose. "Jessica is doing such a wonderful job with everyone," Mom continued, adjusting the pearl necklace she only wore for special occasions. "Mrs. Henderson was just telling me how impressed she is with Jessica's career in Manhattan." "What about my career?" The words slipped out before I could stop them. Mom paused, genuinely surprised by the question. "Oh, honey, we're proud of your little catering business. But Jessica has such a demanding position at that digital agency. She needs to relax when she comes home. My little catering business." Those words hit me harder than they should have. Mitchell's catering wasn't little by any measure. Last year, we generated $285,000 in revenue. I employed 8 people and had clients booking events 18 months in advance. But apparently none of that mattered compared to Jessica's job coordinating social media campaigns. Through the doorway, I could see Jessica holding court near the fireplace, surrounded by Dad's old colleagues and some of the neighbors. She was telling some animated story about her work, gesturing with her champagne glass, while everyone nodded like she was sharing the secrets of the universe. Marcus stood beside her, but he looked distracted constantly, checking his phone and running his hand through his hair in obvious frustration. Patricia Thompson, Marcus's mother, was watching the whole scene with the sharp attention of someone who made her living reading people and situations. As one of the most successful real estate attorneys in Westchester County, Patricia had probably witnessed more family drama than a soap opera writer. The way she was observing Jessica and Marcus told me she was seeing something the rest of us were missing. Dad wandered into the kitchen around 7:30, looking for another beer, and probably hoping to avoid whatever tension he sensed building between Mom and me. "Those appetizers are incredible, Sarah," he said, grabbing a bottle from the refrigerator. "Everyone's talking about how delicious they are." "Thanks, Dad. Maybe I can actually meet some of these people after I finish cooking their entire dinner." He gave me that look I'd seen my whole life, the one that said he understood I was upset but really didn't want to deal with the emotional complexity of it all. "You know how these things work, sweetheart. Someone has to handle the food, and you're so talented at it. Jessica is better with the people side of things. The people side of things." As if feeding 18 people, creating an atmosphere where they could relax and enjoy themselves wasn't the most people-focused thing you could possibly do. But in Dad's mind, being good with people meant making small talk in a cocktail dress, not actually taking care of anyone's needs. I watched him return to the living room, where he immediately joined the circle around Jessica. She was now describing some trendy restaurant in Soho, complete with detailed explanations of the plating and flavor profiles. The irony was almost unbearable. Here I was, a professional chef with 6 years of experience invisible in my own kitchen, while Jessica held everyone spellbound talking about food she'd probably photographed for Instagram once. The contrast between our situations couldn't have been more obvious. Jessica stood there in her designer dress, champagne in hand, being praised and admired, while I wore an apron and handled all the work that made the evening possible. It felt like a metaphor for our entire relationship. Around 8 o'clock, Patricia Thompson appeared in the kitchen doorway. She was an elegant woman in her late 50s, with silver hair pulled back in a sophisticated chignon and intelligent blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "Excuse me," she said politely. "I was looking for the powder room, but I wanted to tell you how impressive this spread looks." "Thank you," I replied, wiping my hands on my apron. "The powder room is just down the hall, first door on the right." Instead of leaving immediately, she stepped further into the kitchen, taking in the elaborate preparation covering every surface. "You're managing all of this yourself, pretty much." "It's what I do for a living, so it's not unusual for me." "What kind of catering business do you run? Corporate events? Weddings? Private parties?" "I started Mitchell's Catering 6 years ago, and we're booked solid through next September." "Very impressive," she said, and something in her tone suggested she genuinely meant it. She glanced back toward the living room, where Jessica's distinctive laugh was rising above the general conversation, then looked at me again. "Your sister certainly knows how to work a room." There was something careful in the way she said it, a lawyer's precision that made me study her face more closely. Patricia Thompson didn't seem like someone who made casual observations or gave empty compliments. "She's always been the social butterfly in the family," I said carefully. Patricia nodded slowly, but her expression remained thoughtful. "Sometimes the people doing the most important work are the ones who get noticed the least," she said quietly. Before I could figure out how to respond to that loaded comment, she excused herself to find the powder room. But I stood there for several minutes afterward, wondering what exactly Patricia Thompson had observed that prompted such a pointed observation to someone she'd just met. Something was definitely happening tonight that went beyond the usual family dynamics, and I was beginning to suspect that Patricia Thompson knew exactly what it was. I needed to serve the appetizers, which meant walking through the living room where Jessica was performing her perfect hostess act. As I carried the silver platters past the chatting guests, I noticed Mom had spread family photo albums across every surface, like some kind of museum exhibit. Serving food while trying to avoid those photos was impossible. Every album told the same painful story. Page after page showed Jessica front and center in every family moment. Her kindergarten graduation in a yellow dress with our parents beaming beside her. High school prom surrounded by friends. College graduation from SUNY Purchase with the whole family gathered around her. In every single photo where we appeared together, Jessica was positioned prominently while I hovered at the edges or seemed cut off at the margins. Christmas mornings, with Jessica perfectly centered by the tree, while I was barely visible behind other relatives. Beach vacations where she posed confidently in the foreground, while I appeared as an afterthought in the background. The pattern was too consistent to be accidental. Someone had made deliberate choices about which moments deserved preserving and how they should be framed. Apparently, my moments weren't worth remembering. Mrs. Chen picked up one of the leather albums while I arranged appetizers on the dining room buffet. "Oh, Linda," she called to my mother. "Jessica was such a beautiful child. Look at this adorable picture of her in that pink tutu." I recognized the photo immediately. Jessica at 7 in her ballet recital costume. What Mrs. Chen couldn't see was that I had performed in that same recital, equally excited and proud. But somehow only Jessica's moment had made it into the family archive. "She's always been photogenic, Mom," replied, practically glowing. "Jessica has that natural grace. Some people are just born with it. Natural grace." I wondered if that's what they called it when parents spent 18 years making sure the camera focused on one daughter while the other learned to fade into the background. Moving through the room, collecting empty plates, I overheard Jessica describing her work to Uncle Paul and the Hendersons. She was gesturing with her champagne glass, making her marketing coordinator job sound like she was running a Fortune 500 company. "We completely revolutionized their brand strategy," she was saying confidently. "The client was so impressed they're fast-tracking me for a senior position. It's exactly the career breakthrough I've been working toward." Everyone murmured appreciatively, asking follow-up questions about her creative process. Meanwhile, I moved invisibly around them, collecting their dishes, despite being the one who'd made their elegant evening possible. The irony was surreal. Jessica received praise for talking about work while I was actually working right in front of everyone, and might as well have been furniture. When I returned to the kitchen with dirty dishes, I discovered something that made my blood freeze. Mom's leather purse sat open on the counter, and papers had spilled out when she'd searched for her reading glasses. Among them were credit card statements with my name printed clearly at the top. My stomach dropped as I picked up the first statement. Sarah E. Mitchell, followed by an address I'd never lived at and an account number I didn't recognize. The charges were recent, mostly from the past 6 months. $1,200 at Bergdorf Goodman, $800 at Tiffany. Multiple expensive Manhattan restaurant charges. A $4,000 payment to Elegant Events Planning. With shaking hands, I gathered the other scattered statements. 4 different credit cards, all bearing my name and social security number, all carrying substantial balances. $45,000 in debt spread across accounts I'd never opened for purchases I'd never made. This wasn't favoritism anymore. This was criminal fraud committed by my own family. The Tiffany charge coincided with Jessica showing off her new diamond bracelet last month, claiming Marcus had surprised her. The Elegant Events payment matched exactly what she'd said she'd saved for her wedding venue deposit. My hands trembled as I photographed each statement with my phone before carefully arranging them as I'd found them. How long had this been going on? How many other fraudulent accounts existed, and who else in my family was stealing my identity? Suddenly, Jessica's nervous behavior tonight made perfect sense. The trembling hands, constant phone checking, forced brightness. Marcus's stress and worried glances. Even Patricia Thompson's pointed questions about family dynamics took on new meaning. I was still standing there in shock when Patricia appeared in the doorway again, carrying an empty wine glass and wearing the expression of someone looking for an excuse to check on me. "Are you all right, Sarah?" she asked quietly, her lawyer's eye taking in my obvious distress. "You look like you've had some kind of shock." "I'm fine," I managed, though my voice sounded strained. "Just tired from all the cooking." She studied me carefully, and I could see her legal mind processing information. "Sometimes family situations are more complicated than they appear," she said meaningfully. "People aren't always who we think they are, even when we've known them our whole lives." Before I could respond, she returned to the party. But I remained frozen in that kitchen, surrounded by evidence of financial crimes committed by my own family, wondering what other secrets were hidden in this house, and whether Patricia Thompson already knew exactly what they were. By 9 o'clock, I was exhausted from hours of cooking, while the party reached its peak energy in the next room. The main course was ready to serve, which meant another trip through the living room, where Jessica continued to dazzle everyone with her charm and wit. I balanced the heavy platters of beef tenderloin and roasted vegetables, weaving between clusters of guests who barely acknowledged my presence as I set up the buffet. That's when I overheard the conversation that broke something inside me. Jessica was standing near the fireplace, surrounded by Mrs. Henderson, Uncle Paul, and two of Marcus's colleagues from the investment bank. Her voice carried that sweet, grateful tone she used when she wanted to seem humble. "I'm so incredibly lucky to have such a wonderful sister who takes care of everything for our family," she was saying, gesturing gracefully with her champagne flute. "Sarah just loves doing all this cooking and hosting. She's always been so selfless, always putting family first. I honestly don't know what we'd do without her." The group murmured appreciatively, making comments about how blessed Jessica was to have such a devoted sister. Mrs. Henderson actually placed her hand over her heart and said something about the beauty of sisterly love. Uncle Paul nodded sagely and mentioned how rare it was to see such family dedication in young people these days. Standing there with my serving spoons, wearing my stained apron, I felt like I was watching someone else receive credit for my entire existence. Jessica was being praised for having a helpful sister, while I was literally serving their dinner and being completely invisible to everyone in that room. I tried to join the conversation when someone mentioned a new restaurant in downtown White Plains. "Actually," I said, stepping closer to the group, "I catered an event there last month. The chef has an interesting approach to farm-to-table sourcing." But before I could finish my sentence, Mom appeared at my elbow with that tight smile she used when she was annoyed. "Sarah, honey," she said in a voice that sounded sweet but carried an unmistakable warning, "the dessert won't prepare itself. People will be expecting something special for midnight." The conversation immediately shifted back to Jessica, who launched into another story about her marketing work, while I was dismissed like hired help. I caught Patricia Thompson watching this entire exchange from across the room, her expression unreadable, but her attention focused entirely on our family dynamic. Walking back toward the kitchen, I passed the dining room where Dad was holding court with some of his old insurance buddies and a few neighbors. He had just raised his wine glass in what appeared to be an impromptu toast. "Here's to my beautiful daughter Jessica and her wonderful fiancé Marcus," he announced proudly. We couldn't be more thrilled about their upcoming wedding. Jessica has always made us so proud with everything she accomplishes. She's got that special something that just draws people to her. Everyone raised their glasses and drank to Jessica's success, her charm, her bright future. Dad's voice carried the kind of genuine warmth and pride that I'd spent 34 years hoping to hear directed at me just once. But as usual, I was invisible during this moment of family celebration, carrying dirty dishes back to the kitchen while they toasted the golden child. The final straw came when I returned to clear the main course plates. Jessica had moved to the center of the living room and was telling an animated story about some charity gala she'd attended in Manhattan. She was describing the event like she'd organized it instead of just being a guest, making herself sound like some kind of philanthropic socialite. The most amazing part, she was saying to her captivated audience, was seeing how much good we can do when we really commit to helping others. It's so important to give back, to think about people who are less fortunate than we are. That's always been my philosophy, you know. Service to others. Service to others. The words hit me like a physical blow. Jessica was standing there talking about service while I had spent the entire evening actually serving, actually taking care of everyone's needs, actually putting others before myself. She was receiving praise for her philosophy of helping people while I was doing the actual helping and being treated like invisible staff. I looked around that room at all the faces nodding in admiration at Jessica's words about selflessness and service. Not one of them seemed to notice the irony that the person actually demonstrating those qualities was the one they were ignoring completely. Patricia Thompson caught my eye at that moment and gave me a look that was part sympathy and part something else. Recognition, maybe. Or possibly confirmation of something she'd already suspected about my family's dynamics. Something inside me snapped at that moment. Not in an explosive way, but more like a cable that had been stretched too tight for too many years, finally reaching its breaking point. I stood there holding an empty serving platter, watching my sister receive accolades for values I actually lived, while being completely overlooked by everyone who mattered to me. I walked slowly back to the kitchen, untied my apron, and set it carefully on the counter next to the stove. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't care about the unfinished dessert, or the dirty dishes piled in the sink, or the expectations that had been placed on me since childhood. I grabbed my coat and purse from the hall closet and walked quietly toward the front door. Behind me, the party continued with laughter and music, and Jessica's voice rising above it all, still charming everyone with her stories about caring for others. Nobody noticed me leave. Nobody called out to ask where I was going. I was so accustomed to being invisible that my absence didn't even register in a room full of people I'd been taking care of all evening. As I reached my car in the driveway, I could still hear the sounds of celebration coming from inside the house, and for the first time in years, those sounds felt like they belonged to someone else's life entirely. The drive to my apartment in White Plains felt like escaping from a prison I hadn't realized I was trapped in. As I pulled away from my parents' circular driveway, the party sounds faded behind me, replaced by quiet radio music and the peaceful hum of my Honda Civic. For the first time all evening, I could breathe without feeling like I was taking up space that belonged to someone more important. My apartment complex was nothing fancy, just a modest 2-bedroom place I'd rented for 4 years. But pulling into my assigned parking spot felt like coming home to myself in a way that visiting the family house never did. The contrast was striking. At the mansion, I was invisible kitchen help. Here, I was Sarah Mitchell, successful business owner. Walking up to my second-floor unit, I felt the weight of tonight's discoveries settling over me. The credit card fraud, Jessica's performance, my complete dismissal. My hands still shook as I unlocked the door and stepped into space that actually reflected who I was. My living room walls displayed framed photos from catering events I'd organized. Corporate holiday parties where executives thanked me personally for exceptional service. Wedding receptions where brides hugged me with grateful tears. Awards from the Westchester County Small Business Association, recognizing Mitchell's Catering for outstanding service and community involvement. This was my real life. Not the servant role I played at family gatherings, but a respected professional who'd built something meaningful. I walked to my home office, which doubled as business headquarters, and looked at the scheduling board, showing bookings solid through next year. Sitting at my desk, I pulled out my phone and scrolled through photos of those credit card statements. Seeing them again in my quiet space made the betrayal feel even more devastating. My parents had stolen my identity to fund Jessica's lifestyle, and they'd been doing it systematically for months. I opened my laptop and logged into my credit monitoring account, something I'd set up when I started the business. The report made my stomach drop. 7 credit inquiries in the past year for accounts I'd never applied for. My credit score had dropped 60 points from late payments on accounts I didn't know existed. The fraud scope was breathtaking. They hadn't just opened a few credit cards. They'd created an entire shadow financial life using my identity, complete with utility account store cards and what appeared to be a car loan for a vehicle I'd never seen. Total debt was approaching $60,000, all tied to my name. I thought about Jessica's expensive purchases over the past year, the designer handbag she'd supposedly saved for, weekend trips to Martha's Vineyard that Marcus had allegedly paid for, professional engagement photos that came through her agency connections, all funded with credit stolen in my name. Even worse, my monthly $3,200 payments to help with my parents' retirement had been enabling this fraud. I'd been voluntarily giving them money while they simultaneously stole from me, creating a perfect system where I was both victim and unwitting accomplice. My phone buzzed with a text from Jenny, my business partner, who helped with larger events. "Hope your family party is going well. See you Monday for Peterson wedding prep." The Peterson wedding, a 200-guest affair at the Ritz-Carlton, generating $15,000 in profit. Jenny respected my expertise, trusted my judgment, treated me as an equal partner. She'd never dream of relegating me to kitchen duty while someone else took credit. I changed out of my party dress and looked at myself in the bedroom mirror, trying to reconcile the confident business owner I saw with the dismissed invisible person I became at my parents' house. In my professional-grade kitchen, I made tea and sat down to process what I'd discovered. The credit card fraud was a federal crime. Identity theft could result in serious jail time for everyone involved. Jessica, Mom, Dad, possibly Marcus, if he'd knowingly benefited from stolen funds. I pulled up contact information for David Chen, the estate planning attorney I'd been quietly consulting about irregularities in Grandmother Rose's will. David specialized in family financial disputes and had been helping me investigate discrepancies in probate records. Now I realized those discrepancies were just the tip of a much larger iceberg. It was past 10, too late to call, but I composed an email describing my discoveries and attached the credit card statement photos. This wasn't about hurt feelings anymore. This was about crimes that could destroy lives committed by people supposed to love and protect me. Sitting in my quiet apartment surrounded by evidence of the successful life I'd built despite family neglect, I realized tonight had been a turning point. Not just because I'd walked away from their party, but because I'd finally seen how little I mattered to them. They'd committed federal crimes using my identity while treating me like hired help at social gatherings. The cruelty was almost too much to process. My phone stayed completely silent. No texts asking where I'd gone, no calls wondering if I was okay. My dramatic departure hadn't even registered with people supposed to care about my well-being. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't planning to apologize for disappointing them. I was planning to protect myself from people who'd proven they would hurt me without hesitation. The discovery that would change everything had actually happened 2 weeks earlier, but I hadn't been ready to face what it meant until tonight. It was mid-December when Mom asked me to help clear out some storage boxes in the attic. She wanted to make room for Christmas decorations, and Dad's back wasn't what it used to be after 30 years of sitting at insurance desks. I'd climbed up there with my usual willingness to help, sorting through decades of accumulated family memories. Photo albums from the 70s, my old school report cards that nobody had ever celebrated, boxes of Jessica's childhood artwork that Mom had carefully preserved. It was like archaeologically excavating the evidence of my own invisibility layer by layer. Behind an old steamer trunk that had belonged to my great-aunt, I noticed something that didn't belong with the usual attic clutter. A small fireproof safe, the kind people use for important documents, tucked away in the corner where nobody would think to look unless they were specifically cleaning. The safe wasn't locked. When I opened it, I found papers that made my hands start shaking before I even understood what I was looking at. There was a handwritten will, dated March 15, 2019, just 3 months before Grandmother Rose passed away. The paper was cream-colored heavy stock with Rose's distinctive handwriting in blue ink. I, Rose, Catherine Mitchell, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath my property, located at 47 Maple Avenue, Westchester County, New York, to be divided equally between my beloved granddaughters, Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell and Jessica Marie Mitchell. This house has been my joy for 47 years, and I pray it will bring both girls the security and happiness they deserve. The will was witnessed by 2 signatures I didn't recognize and notarized with an official stamp. Everything about it looked legitimate and legal, but it was completely different from the will that had been read to our family after Rose's funeral. I sat on that dusty attic floor reading the document over and over again. According to the will that went through probate court, Grandmother Rose had left the entire house to Jessica alone. That will had seemed heartbreaking but believable, given the family's obvious favoritism. This will, however, suggested something much more sinister. Instead of confronting my parents immediately, I'd taken photos of every page and quietly put the document back exactly where I'd found it. Something told me I needed professional advice before making any accusations about forged wills and inheritance fraud. The next week, I'd contacted David Chen, an estate planning attorney whose office was in downtown White Plains. David was in his mid-40s with the kind of calm, methodical approach that came from years of dealing with complicated family disputes. His consultation fee was $250, money I'd gladly paid for clarity about my situation. David had studied the photos, carefully examining the handwriting, the notary seal, and the witness signatures. Everything appears authentic, he'd told me during our meeting. The question is why this will didn't go through probate instead of the one that awarded the house solely to your sister. He'd explained that New York state law required the most recent valid will to supersede any previous documents. If Rose had written this will in March 2019, it should have taken precedence over any earlier versions. The fact that a different will had been probated suggested either fraud or a serious legal error. David had advised me to run a complete credit check and examine any financial documents I could access. Family financial fraud often involves multiple layers of deception, he'd warned. If they were willing to manipulate an inheritance, they might be comfortable with other illegal activities. That's when I'd discovered the credit cards in my name. Following David's advice, I'd requested my full credit report and found accounts I'd never opened, debts I'd never incurred, and financial obligations that were destroying my credit score while funding my family's lifestyle. Over the past 2 weeks, I'd been quietly investigating the scope of the fraud while continuing to play my role as the helpful, invisible daughter. I'd photographed financial documents when my parents weren't looking. I'd researched the legal penalties for identity theft and inheritance fraud. I'd even drive by the county clerk's office to understand how probate records were filed and stored. What I'd discovered was systematic, deliberate financial abuse spanning years. The credit cards were just the beginning. They'd also forged my signature on a home equity loan, opened utility accounts in my name for properties I'd never lived in, and even taken out a car loan that was tied to my credit but benefited Jessica directly. The most painful part was realizing that my monthly financial support to my parents had been enabling their crimes against me. Every $3,200 I'd sent them to help with retirement expenses had freed up their legitimate income to cover the minimum payments on the fraudulent accounts. I'd been funding my own financial destruction while believing I was being a good daughter. David had explained that the evidence I'd gathered could result in federal charges against all 3 family members. Identity theft, wire fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy charges could mean serious prison time, not just financial restitution. But he'd also warned me about the emotional cost of pursuing legal action against family members. Are you prepared for the possibility that this could destroy your relationships permanently? He'd asked. Criminal prosecutions involving family members rarely end with reconciliation. I told him I needed time to think about my options. But sitting in my apartment tonight, looking at fresh evidence of their willingness to commit crimes while treating me like hired help, I realized my decision had already been made. They'd chosen to steal from me rather than treat me with basic respect. They'd chosen to commit felonies rather than acknowledge my worth as a human being. Now I had to choose whether to protect them or protect myself, and for the first time in my adult life, I was ready to choose myself. The full scope of my family's financial crimes became clearer over the following days as I dug deeper into the evidence David Chen had advised me to gather. What I'd initially discovered in Mom's purse was just the tip of an iceberg that extended much further than I'd imagined possible. Using the account numbers from those credit card statements, I was able to request detailed transaction histories that painted a disturbing picture of systematic theft. The 4 credit cards I'd found weren't the only accounts opened in my name. There were 3 additional store credit cards, a gas card, and what appeared to be a personal loan from a finance company that specialized in people with poor credit. The total debt across all fraudulent accounts was $73,000. $73,000 of debt tied to my name and social security number for purchases that had funded Jessica's lifestyle while destroying my financial future. But the credit cards were only part of the story. David had suggested I examine any other financial documents I could access, and what I found in my parents' home office made me physically sick. They'd forged my signature on a $28,000 home equity loan using Grandmother Rose's house as collateral. The loan paperwork showed my supposed income as twice what I actually earned with employment verification from a company that didn't exist. Even more disturbing, they'd listed me as a co-signer on utility accounts for 3 different properties, including an apartment in Manhattan that Jessica had supposedly been sharing with a roommate. I'd been financially responsible for her rent, electricity, and cable bills for the past 18 months without even knowing it. The apartment revelation explained something that had puzzled me for months. Jessica had been talking about her expensive Manhattan lifestyle, her trendy neighborhood, her amazing roommate who worked in fashion. I'd assumed Marcus was helping with expenses, or that she'd gotten a raise at the marketing agency. Instead, my stolen identity had been paying for her to live in a luxury 1-bedroom in Soho, while I drove my 6-year-old Honda and lived in a modest apartment in White Plains. David had walked me through the legal implications during our second meeting. Identity theft at this level was a federal crime punishable by up to 15 years in prison and fines up to $250,000 per count. The home equity loan fraud alone could result in charges for wire fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy. But the most devastating discovery came when I traced my own voluntary payments to my parents over the past 4 years. I'd been sending them $3,200 every month since January 2020, believing I was helping with their retirement expenses. The total amount was $153,600. When I cross-referenced those payments with the minimum payment schedules on the fraudulent accounts, I realized the horrible truth. My voluntary financial support had been covering the monthly minimums on the debt they'd accumulated in my name. I hadn't just been a victim of their crimes, I'd been unknowingly funding them. Every month when I'd proudly sent money to help my aging parents, I'd actually been enabling them to steal more from me. They'd used my generosity to maintain the fraudulent accounts while accumulating additional debt. It was a perfect criminal system where the victim paid for her own financial destruction. The emotional impact was almost unbearable. I'd spent 4 years feeling good about myself for taking care of my parents, proud that my successful business allowed me to ensure their comfortable retirement. Instead, I'd been the unwitting accomplice in a scheme that had cost me over $200,000 when you added the stolen inheritance, fraudulent debts, and my voluntary payments. David had explained that recovering the money would require criminal prosecution of my family members. Civil lawsuits could reclaim some damages, but without criminal charges, there was little incentive for them to cooperate with restitution. The choice was stark: pursue justice and likely send my parents and sister to prison, or accept the financial devastation and try to rebuild my credit and savings from scratch. There was also the question of whether Marcus knew about Jessica's crimes. The luxury apartment lease showed him as an emergency contact, and several of the credit card charges were from restaurants and stores in Manhattan that he would have likely visited with her. If he was aware that Jessica was using stolen credit to fund their lifestyle, he could face charges as an accessory. I'd spent the past 2 weeks since learning all this trying to decide what to do. Part of me still hoped there was some misunderstanding, some way this could be resolved within the family without destroying lives and relationships. But tonight's party had shown me exactly how my family viewed me. They saw me as someone they could steal from, lie to, and treat like hired help without consequence. They'd committed federal crimes against me while relegating me to invisible servant status at their social gatherings. The cruelty was breathtaking in its completeness. David had scheduled another appointment for January 2nd, right after the New Year holiday. He'd given me homework to complete before then. Document any additional evidence I could find, make copies of all relevant financial records, and most importantly, decide whether I was prepared to pursue criminal charges against my own family. Sitting in my apartment at 11:30 on New Year's Eve, looking at spreadsheets that showed the systematic theft of my financial security, I realized my decision had been made the moment I walked out of that party. They'd chosen to destroy me financially rather than treat me with basic human decency. Now I had to choose whether to let them continue or fight back with every legal weapon available to me. For the first time in my life, I was ready to choose myself over their comfort, my future over their criminal enterprise, and justice over keeping peace in a family that had never valued my well-being anyway. At 11:45, my phone started ringing. The first call came from Mom, and I could hear the panic in her voice, even through the voicemail she left when I didn't answer. "Sarah, where are you? The kitchen is a complete disaster, and people are asking about dessert. You can't just leave in the middle of hosting a party." Hosting a party. As if I'd been the host instead of the unpaid kitchen staff. I let the call go to voicemail and watched as my phone immediately lit up again. This time it was Jessica, and her voice carried a sharp edge of fear beneath the usual entitlement. "What the hell, Sarah? You can't just disappear when we have guests. Get back here right now. People are starting to ask questions and Mom is freaking out." The calls kept coming one after another like a dam had burst. Dad called 3 times in 5 minutes, his messages progressing from annoyed to genuinely worried. "Sarah, sweetheart, I don't know what's gotten into you, but you need to come back and help us figure this out. The guests don't understand why there's no dessert, and the kitchen looks like a tornado hit it." By midnight, I had 18 missed calls from Mom alone. Her voicemails became increasingly desperate with each message. "Sarah, please, we need you." Jessica tried to finish the cooking, but she burned everything she touched. The smoke alarm went off twice, and Mrs. Henderson is asking if we should call the fire department. Jessica's messages were revealing in their desperation. "Look, I'm sorry if your feelings got hurt or whatever, but you're being ridiculous. Come back and we can talk about this later. People are starting to leave because there's no food, and Marcus is asking where you went." The most telling call came from Dad around 12:15. His voice was shaking, and for the first time I could remember, he sounded genuinely lost. "Sarah, I know we don't always appreciate everything you do, but we really need you right now. Your sister is in the bathroom crying and your mother is having some kind of panic attack. Please come home. But it was the calls from the party guests that really drove home how invisible I'd been. Mrs. Henderson called at 12:20, sounding confused and concerned. Sarah, dear, your mother gave me your number and asked me to call. She says you had some kind of emergency, but nobody knows where you went. Is everything all right? Even Uncle Paul called, which was unprecedented since he'd never shown any interest in my existence beyond accepting the food I cooked. Sarah, your parents are beside themselves. Your mother keeps saying something about the dessert course, but I think there's more going on here. Can you call them back? The most revealing message came from someone I didn't immediately recognize, a man's voice formal and slightly annoyed. This is Richard Steinberg. I work with your father at Mutual Insurance. Your mother asked me to call because apparently you're the only one who knows where everything is in the kitchen. Look, I don't mean to get involved in family business, but people are starting to leave and it's getting uncomfortable. By 12:30, I had 44 missed calls. 44 desperate attempts to drag me back into my role as the invisible person who made everyone else's social success possible. The panic in those messages told me everything I needed to know about my value to my family. They didn't miss Sarah the daughter or Sarah the person. They missed Sarah the unpaid catering service. The most pathetic call came from Mom at 12:45. She was clearly crying, her voice broken and desperate. Sarah, I don't know what I did wrong, but please come back. The house is a mess, and people are asking questions I don't know how to answer. Jessica locked herself in the bathroom and won't come out. Marcus is talking about leaving. Please, honey, we can fix whatever's wrong. What struck me most was what none of them said. Not one message contained an apology for treating me like hired help. Not one person acknowledged that maybe relegating me to invisible kitchen duty while praising Jessica for my work might have been hurtful. They were sorry about the consequences of my absence, but not about the treatment that had driven me away. Jessica's final message, left at 12:58, was the most revealing of all. Fine, Sarah, you've made your point. Everyone knows you're upset now. The party is ruined and Mom is humiliated in front of all her friends. I hope you're happy. But you better get back here tomorrow and help us clean up this mess you created. The mess I created. Even in her desperation, Jessica couldn't acknowledge that maybe the family's treatment of me had been the problem. In her mind, I was still the person responsible for managing everyone else's comfort and success. I sat in my quiet apartment listening to message after message of increasing panic and realized something profound had shifted. For 34 years, I'd been conditioned to feel guilty when other people were upset, especially when their upset was caused by my failure to meet their expectations. But tonight, I felt nothing but clarity. They weren't calling because they missed me or because they'd realized how poorly they'd treated me. They were calling because their social gathering had collapsed without their unpaid staff member to hold it together. The desperation in their voices wasn't love or concern for my well-being. It was panic about their own embarrassment and inconvenience. The silence between the calls was the most peaceful I'd felt in years. No one demanding that I cook or clean or serve or smile. No one taking credit for my work or dismissing my achievements. Just quiet space to think clearly about what kind of life I wanted to live and what kind of family relationships I was willing to accept. At 1:15, my phone finally stopped ringing. The party was officially over, and apparently so was my family's emergency. But something told me that tomorrow would bring a whole new level of manipulation and pressure as they tried to force me back into the role I'd abandoned. The difference was that tonight I'd finally seen clearly what that role had cost me both financially and emotionally. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor who would reveal the truth about Jessica's perfect facade. I was having coffee at my kitchen table when my building's buzzer rang at 9:30. Through the intercom, I heard a familiar voice. Sarah, this is Patricia Thompson, Marcus's mother. Could I come up? I need to discuss something important about last night. I buzzed her up, wondering what could bring Westchester County's top real estate attorney to my modest apartment on New Year's Day. Patricia appeared at my door looking professionally composed despite the early hour, carrying her signature leather briefcase. "Thank you for seeing me," she said as I let her in. "What I witnessed last night concerns me both as Marcus's mother and as someone who's handled family disputes for 25 years. She declined coffee but accepted a seat at my dining table. "Sarah, I need to tell you something about Jessica and Marcus that your family doesn't know. Something I wish I didn't know either." Patricia opened her briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. "What I'm sharing is confidential, but given last night, and what I know about Jessica's situation, you deserve to understand what's really happening." She handed me a document that made my hands shake. It was a legal separation petition filed in Westchester County Family Court 6 months ago. Marcus Thompson versus Jessica Marie Mitchell Thompson, citing irreconcilable differences. "They're already married?" I asked, confused by the names on the legal papers. "They eloped 8 months ago in the Bahamas," Patricia explained. "Kept it secret while planning this elaborate wedding for show. But Marcus discovered Jessica's affair with her coworker 3 weeks after their honeymoon. The betrayal was devastating, but what Patricia told me next explained Jessica's recent desperation. The prenuptial agreement left Jessica with virtually nothing in the divorce. No alimony, no property settlement, no claim to Marcus's assets or family wealth. Jessica's been fighting the separation for months, hoping to reconcile, but Marcus found evidence of multiple affairs throughout their relationship. A married partner at her marketing firm, someone from her college network. There were others. Patricia showed me printed messages revealing Jessica as someone who manipulated multiple men while planning her future around Marcus's money. The texts painted a picture of calculated relationships viewed as financial opportunities rather than emotional connections. But the most disturbing revelation was still coming. During divorce proceedings, Patricia had discovered irregularities in Jessica's finances. "Your sister's been living far beyond her marketing salary," she explained. "The luxury apartment designer clothes expensive lifestyle. None of it's sustainable on her legitimate income." When I asked how she knew this, Patricia's answer made my stomach drop. "We ran credit checks for the divorce. Jessica's report shows multiple accounts that don't match her employment or declared income. Several accounts appear linked to someone else's identity." Someone else's identity. The words hung between us as Patricia watched my face carefully. She'd figured out what my family was doing. "I suspect Jessica's involved in identity theft," Patricia continued. "Given how your parents treated you last night and Jessica's obvious desperation, I'm concerned you might be the victim." I showed Patricia the credit card statement photos on my phone. Her expression shifted from concern to professional alarm as she studied the evidence. "This is federal wire fraud," she said quietly. "Identity theft at this level means serious prison time. If your parents are involved, we're looking at conspiracy charges for the entire family." Patricia explained that Jessica's divorce had created a financial crisis. "She's facing complete ruin," Patricia said. "No divorce settlement, no assets, and a lifestyle she can't maintain legitimately. The identity theft appears to be her attempt to avoid bankruptcy and social humiliation." There was more. Patricia had discovered Jessica was actually on probation at the marketing agency for poor performance and might be terminated after the holidays. Everything about Jessica's perfect life was a lie funded by crimes against her own sister. The designer clothes, Manhattan apartment, confident persona, all of it depended on stolen credit and forged documents. Patricia packed her papers and looked at me with the expression of someone delivering necessary but difficult news. "Sarah, you deserve to know what you're dealing with. Jessica isn't just the favored daughter. She's someone willing to destroy your financial future for her lifestyle. As an attorney, I must tell you, this will likely become criminal whether you want it or not." The evidence is too extensive to ignore, and financial institutions must report suspected fraud to federal authorities. She stood to leave, then paused at my door. One more thing. Marcus wants to testify in any legal proceedings you pursue. He feels partially responsible for not recognizing Jessica's character sooner and wants to help ensure she faces consequences. After Patricia left, I sat processing everything I'd learned. Jessica's perfect life was built on lies and crimes, funded by stealing my identity while treating me like hired help. The cruelty was incomprehensible, but it explained my family's behavior and gave me the final information I needed to move forward with protecting myself from people who'd proven they would destroy me without hesitation. David Chen called me Monday morning with news that moved everything into a different category entirely. His voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent the weekend reviewing evidence that could destroy lives and send people to prison. "Sarah, I've filed the complaint with the probate court challenging your grandmother's will," he said without preamble. "But more importantly, I've contacted the Westchester County District Attorney's Office about the identity theft and financial fraud. They want to meet with you this week. The DA's office." The words made my chest tighten. This wasn't just a family dispute anymore. This was heading toward criminal prosecution with real consequences that couldn't be undone. "Detective Maria Rodriguez from the Financial Crimes Unit will be handling your case," David continued. "She's one of the best in the state at prosecuting identity theft rings. The evidence you've provided is some of the most comprehensive she's seen in a family fraud case." David explained that the scope of the crimes had impressed even seasoned investigators. Between the forged will, the identity theft, the fraudulent credit accounts, and the home equity loan, we were looking at multiple federal charges that could result in serious prison time for everyone involved. "The detective wants to interview you Thursday morning at 9, he said. "She'll need you to provide testimony about how you discovered the fraud, identify forged signatures, and walk through the timeline of financial abuse." "Are you prepared for that level of involvement?" I told him I was, though my voice shook slightly as I said it. The reality of potentially sending my own parents to prison was starting to sink in, but so was the reality of what they'd done to me. David had more news. The forensic accountant's preliminary report shows total damages of approximately $800,000. That includes the stolen inheritance, fraudulent debts, forged loan, and the money you voluntarily paid while being defrauded. It's one of the largest family fraud cases the county has prosecuted. $800,000. The number was staggering. They hadn't just hurt me or taken advantage of family generosity. They'd systematically destroyed my financial future while treating me like hired help at social gatherings. But David's next piece of information changed everything. "Detective Rodriguez has also discovered that your family isn't the only victim. The credit monitoring services have flagged similar patterns of fraud involving 2 other women in Westchester County. This might be part of a larger identity theft operation. Other victims. The possibility that my family's crimes extended beyond me made the situation even more serious. If they'd been stealing from strangers as well as family members, the federal charges would be even more severe. The detective will want to know if you're aware of your parents or sister having access to other people's personal information," David explained. "Employment records, client databases, anything that might explain how they obtained other victims' identities." I thought about Mom's 30 years as a school principal with access to student and family records, Dad's insurance career with client files containing social security numbers and financial information, Jessica's marketing job with access to customer databases. The opportunities for identity theft had been everywhere. David scheduled my meeting with Detective Rodriguez for Thursday at the DA's office in White Plains. He warned me that the interview would be thorough and potentially emotional, but necessary for building a strong case. "You should also know," he added, "that once this investigation becomes official, there's no going back. Criminal prosecutions follow their own timeline regardless of what the victims want. If the evidence supports charges, they'll be filed whether your family cooperates or not. The finality of that statement hit me hard. I was about to cross a line that would fundamentally change my family forever. But they'd crossed that line first when they decided to commit federal crimes against me. Wednesday afternoon, Detective Rodriguez called me personally. She had a warm but professional voice that immediately made me feel like I was talking to someone who cared about justice rather than just processing cases. Mitchell, I've reviewed the evidence your attorney provided, and I want you to know how impressed I am with your documentation. Most victims of family financial fraud don't discover the crimes until years later, when the damage is much worse. She explained that my photos of the credit card statements combined with the forged will and loan documents provided a clear trail of evidence that would be difficult for any defense attorney to challenge. I also want you to know that we've identified at least 3 other potential victims whose identities appear to have been compromised using similar methods. This suggests your family members have been involved in organized financial crimes for several years. The detective's words confirmed my worst fears. This wasn't just about sibling rivalry or family favoritism. My parents and sister had been running a criminal enterprise that used me as their primary victim while branching out to steal from strangers. She scheduled our formal interview for Thursday morning and warned me that the process would be emotionally difficult but legally necessary. After we hang up, you won't be able to contact your family members about this investigation. Any communication could be construed as witness tampering or obstruction of justice. No contact with my family. The isolation was beginning, but it also felt like protection. For the first time in my adult life, I wouldn't have to worry about their manipulation or demands. Thursday morning would mark the official beginning of a legal process that would likely take months to resolve and would definitely destroy the family relationships I'd spent my entire life trying to maintain. But as I hung up the phone, I realized that those relationships had been built on lies, theft, and emotional abuse anyway. The family I thought I was protecting had been systematically destroying me for years while smiling to my face. The confrontation came 3 days after my interview with Detective Rodriguez. It was January 3rd when she called to tell me they were executing the search warrant at my parents' house. The timing wasn't coincidental. Mom had been leaving increasingly frantic voicemails that I couldn't return due to the no-contact order. Detective Rodriguez asked me to be present as a witness to identify forged signatures and fraudulent documents. The warrant was being served at 2 o'clock Thursday afternoon, deliberately timed to coincide with my parents' traditional post-holiday gathering. When I arrived, 2 unmarked police cars sat in the driveway alongside familiar vehicles. Uncle Paul's Honda, Aunt Susan's BMW, the Hendersons' SUV. At least a dozen relatives were about to witness my family's crimes being exposed. Detective Rodriguez met me at the front door. She was a professional woman in her early 40s, with kind eyes and the calm demeanor of someone who'd handled hundreds of similar cases. She handed me the search warrant and explained everything had to be documented precisely. The doorbell rang at exactly 2 o'clock. I stood behind the detective as Mom answered, wearing her hosting apron. Her face went from confusion to horror as Detective Rodriguez identified herself and presented the warrant. Mrs. Mitchell, we have a court order to search these premises for evidence related to identity theft, wire fraud, and conspiracy charges. Please step aside. Mom's face went white. Behind her, I could see the living room full of family members enjoying coffee and cookies. Uncle Paul stood from the couch, Aunt Susan dropped her teacup, and everyone stared in shock. That's when Mom saw me. "Sarah," she whispered, her voice breaking. "What have you done?" "I haven't done anything, Mom." "You did this to yourself." Dad appeared from the kitchen, saw the police officers, and sank into his chair like all the air had gone out of him. Jessica came running downstairs, expecting minor family drama, and instead found federal agents preparing to search for evidence of her crimes. The detective began explaining the charges, while family members listened in stunned silence. Identity theft, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit financial crimes. The words echoed through the living room, where I'd spent countless holidays being ignored. Jessica broke down completely, crying and yelling simultaneously. "This is all her fault," she screamed, pointing at me. "Sarah's always been jealous, and now she's destroying our family with lies." But Detective Rodriguez had brought evidence. Bank records, credit card statements, forged signatures, loan documents. She spread them across Mom's dining room table while shocked relatives watched their golden child's crimes being displayed. "Miss Mitchell," the detective asked Jessica directly, "can you explain why your sister's credit cards were used for your Manhattan apartment designer purchases and wedding expenses?" Jessica couldn't answer. She just stood crying while Uncle Paul and Aunt Susan stared at evidence of systematic fraud against their own niece. The room fell completely silent, except for Jessica's sobs and police officers opening filing cabinets. Dad tried to minimize everything. "Look, this is a family matter," he told Detective Rodriguez. "Sarah's always been successful. We didn't think she'd mind helping Jessica get established. Mr. Mitchell, identity theft is a federal crime regardless of family relationships. Your daughter didn't consent to these accounts. She didn't even know they existed." The most damaging evidence came next. Detective Rodriguez brought copies of the forged will that had cheated me out of my inheritance. She placed the real handwritten will beside the fake document that went through probate. Aunt Susan, a former legal secretary, immediately spotted the differences. "Linda," she said to my mother, "these signatures don't match. This will was forged." The room erupted in shocked conversations as family members realized the scope of what had been happening. Mrs. Henderson covered her mouth in horror. Uncle Paul shook his head in disgust. Even younger relatives pulled out phones to photograph the evidence. Jessica made one final desperate attempt. "She's lying about everything," she yelled. "Sarah's always hated me because Mom and Dad loved me more. She's making this up for revenge." But the detective had physical evidence that couldn't be explained away. Forged signatures, fraudulent applications, stolen identity documents. The case was solid and everyone could see it. Mom tried salvaging something from the disaster. "Please," she begged. "Detective Rodriguez, can't we work this out privately? We'll pay Sarah back everything. We don't need courts involved." "Mrs. Mitchell, these are federal crimes with mandatory prosecution guidelines. The decision about pressing charges is no longer up to your family." The search took 3 hours. Police removed boxes of documents, computer drives, and files for trial evidence. When they finished, extended family dispersed quickly, leaving just my immediate family in the house that no longer felt like home. "I hope you're satisfied," Mom said quietly. "You've destroyed this family over money." "You destroyed this family when you decided to steal from me," I replied. "Money I never would have begrudged if you'd asked, instead of committing crimes." As I left that house for what I knew would be the last time, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Not guilt or regret, but profound relief that truth was finally out, and justice would be served. 8 months later, I was sitting in David Chen's office, receiving the news I'd been waiting for since that terrible New Year's Eve. The civil case had concluded with complete victory. The court had invalidated the fraudulent will and awarded me rightful 50% ownership of Grandmother Rose's house worth $600,000 at current market value. My parents had reached a plea agreement for probation and full restitution for the financial fraud. The criminal case resulted in suspended sentences contingent on repayment, but their reputation in Westchester County was permanently destroyed. Jessica faced bankruptcy following her divorce and the restitution requirements, and her marketing agency had terminated her employment after the criminal charges became public. The house settlement gave me options I'd never imagined having. I could force a sale and take my half in cash, or I could buy out my parents' remaining share and own the property outright. After everything they'd put me through, I chose compassion over revenge. I sold my half back to them for fair market value, rather than forcing them into homelessness. But I made it clear our relationship had changed permanently. With the legal settlement house sale proceeds and recovery of my stolen funds, I had the capital to transform Mitchell's Catering into something I'd always dreamed of. I expanded into full-service event planning, hired 12 full-time employees, and moved into a beautiful facility in downtown White Plains with a commercial kitchen and elegant showroom. The business grew beyond my wildest expectations. Corporate clients appreciated my attention to detail and professional reliability. Brides trusted me with their most important day because I understood what it meant to create moments that people would remember forever. Within 6 months, we were booking events 8 months in advance. I used part of my settlement to purchase a modern townhouse in a quiet neighborhood where I could host holidays for people who actually valued my company. My chosen family included Jenny, my business partner, who'd become my closest friend, Marcus Thompson, who'd testified in my legal case and remained a supportive friend, several clients who'd become genuine friends over the years, people who saw me as Sarah, the successful businesswoman, not Sarah, the invisible servant. The 44 missed calls from that New Year's Eve represented the last time my biological family took me for granted. They'd called frantically when their social gathering collapsed without their unpaid staff member, but they'd never called to apologize for treating me like hired help or to acknowledge the crimes they'd committed against me. I learned to check my credit report monthly and monitor for any suspicious activity. I educated myself about identity theft protection and estate planning. Most importantly, I learned that family relationships should be based on mutual respect and genuine care, not obligation and exploitation. My parents made a few attempts at reconciliation over the months, usually around holidays, when they realized how much work I'd been doing invisibly for years. But their apologies always focused on wanting things to go back to normal rather than acknowledging the depth of their betrayal. They wanted forgiveness without accountability, relationship without respect. Jessica's life fell apart completely after the divorce and criminal charges. Her Manhattan lifestyle disappeared, her social media presence vanished, and she moved back to a small apartment near our parents. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd finally gotten a job at a local retail store, earning a fraction of her previous salary and living with the consequences of her choices. Sometimes I wondered if I should feel guilty about the destruction of their lives. But then I'd remember the credit card statements with my name on them, the forged will that stole my inheritance, and the way they'd treated me like invisible help while committing federal crimes with my identity. They'd chosen to destroy me financially rather than treat me with basic decency. The consequences were theirs to bear. This past New Year's Eve, I hosted my first party in my new townhouse. 12 guests who genuinely enjoyed my company, appreciated my cooking, and treated me like the successful professional I'd become. We toasted at midnight, surrounded by laughter and warmth, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt like I truly belonged somewhere. The kitchen in my new home is my sanctuary, not my prison. When I cook now, it's because I choose to create something beautiful for people who value both the food and the person making it. When I host gatherings, I'm the celebrated guest of honor at my own table, not the invisible servant cleaning up afterward. Looking back, that New Year's Eve when I walked out of my parents' kitchen was the night I finally chose myself over their comfort, my future over their criminal enterprise, and self-respect over keeping peace in a family that had never valued my well-being. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, taken for granted by people who should love you, or suspected that someone might be stealing your identity or finances, trust your instincts. Check your credit reports regularly. Document suspicious activity. Consult with attorneys when something feels wrong. And remember that real family should celebrate your success, not exploit your generosity. What would you have done in my situation? Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and protecting yourself? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to follow for more real-life stories about finding the courage to stand up for yourself when the people who should protect you are the ones causing harm.